start the session. So first of all, everyone, I hope everyone is very safe. I know this COVID situation is hit everyone and it's a little bit of challenging for everyone. So that's the reason we are holding some online virtual events for GDG Adelaide. So I would like to invite our speaker today, Maksim Lin. So he's a freelance software developer and he has experience working with both Android and Flutter. So today I think it's going to be an awesome event for everyone. So if there is any question, I would like everyone to wait till the end so we can ask all the question. So let's get started our session. So I'm going to invite Maksim Lin. Hello, Maksim.
Thanks very much for a very nice introduction. I'll just bring up my slides for everyone to see. Great, here we go. Excellent, so hopefully you can all see them. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to be having a chat with you about Flutter, giving a quick introduction for those who haven't come across it, or maybe a refresher for those who've heard about it in the past. A little bit about myself. I think, can everyone still see my presentation? Yeah.
No, it's gone, man.
I think the other person's presenting. I'll just see if I can resume.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Hopefully I'm back. Yeah. So a quick bit about myself. My name is Maksim Lin. I'm a Android and more recently Flutter developer. I've recently become also a Google developer expert in Flutter, and I'm a co-organizer here in Melbourne of the GDG Melbourne and Flutter Melbourne meetups. So that's probably about enough about me though. What I wanted to talk to you about is Flutter. Now, for those of you who've never heard about Flutter before, or perhaps have only come across it in passing, I think Flutter is best described as a game engine for app development. And I'll discuss why I think that's a good description shortly. I've been using this for quite a while, but I was pleased to hear that actually Tim Sneath, who's the product manager at Google for Flutter, actually used this term in an interview recently. I don't think he got it from me. I think other people have used this term in the past, but I think it's a really good way to describe what Flutter is, especially compared to, for instance, doing Android development or hybrid web development or something like React Native. So it's really an apt description, I think. Now, in terms of what Flutter is technically, it's can be looked at as three different layers. There's the framework that's built all in the Dart language, which I'll talk about shortly, the engine, which is built in C, C++, and the embedding, which is specific to each platform that Flutter supports. Now, there's a lot of boxes there, and it can get quite complicated. It's probably just to give you a flavor of the fact that while Flutter is actually very easy to use framework, it's also very powerful. The thing is, it's actually very complex as well. But the nice thing is that complexity is, for the most part, very much hidden from the Flutter developer. It's just there's a lot of raw power there, but it's presented to you in a very easy to use way. Now, in terms of what Flutter gives you as an app developer, it gives you essentially a native app. Now, this is quite different from perhaps approaches where you might be using, say, something like a JavaScript engine that's talking to the underlying a native app framework. So for instance, React Native takes that approach where it's essentially bringing JavaScript development, like using the React framework, to native apps. But what happens is your code runs on a JavaScript engine and bridges across to the native, like say Android or iOS framework to display your user interface. which can have like significant implications around performance. Flutter doesn't work that way. Flutter is essentially, from all intents and purposes, a native app. In fact, on Android, it might be even considered more native, if you like, than Java or Kotlin apps, because while they run inside a virtual machine, Flutter has dark code which is compiled down to native, like ARM binaries, for instance, on iOS and Android devices, or Intel on desktop devices such as Windows and Mac, which I'll talk about later, which really provides as lower level as you can really get. And so it gives you extremely good performance when it's running on any device, whether it's desktop or mobile. And it also has a really nice way of integrating with whatever platform it's running on. So you can pretty much use any functionality that's available on that platform, whether it's iOS or Android. And finally, it matches its look to, or it can match its look to the native platform's look and feel. So it's really up to you as a developer to decide whether you want to or not. So Flutter gives you that ability to make your app look like a, as they say in quotes, native app on whichever platform it's running on. Now, one of the kind of key features of Flutter, which it actually shares with other frameworks like React, is what's called declarative UI, declarative user interfaces, which essentially just means that it's a way of building a app where you declare your UI rather than manipulate it. So I'll show you a bit of code in a second to show a bit more in concrete detail what that means. But essentially what you do is you treat your user interface as basically a function of your state. You just basically need to declare that given a state, this is what the user interface looks like. You don't actually have to say, oh, if this, then draw that, if that, then change that color. That's not how it works. It's very much a way of design or building your user interface simply by declaring what it needs to look like based on what the state is at any time in your app. Now, with that, this is actually what about the simplest Flutter code that you can have looks like. So pretty much your standard Hello World app, if you like. It could actually be a little bit simpler than, even more simpler than this, but this is already not only simple, but gives you like actually something reasonable that shows up on the screen if you run it. As you can see, there is very little in the way of boilerplate. It also actually looks a little bit like, for instance, an app that you would write for another framework, say like React. And that's, of course, as I said, because they both share this declarative paradigm for building user interfaces. Also, what you get with Flutter are very deep trees that describe your user interface. So that's very similar to, for instance, web development, where you might be used to having very deeply nested sets of tags that describe your user interface. In that respect, Flutter has that sort of common ancestry with web development. And in fact, a lot of people who initially worked on Flutter came from the web development world and from the Chrome team in Google. So it kind of took what they felt were the best parts of that and improved on it. So while web development uses two separate things, it uses the HTML language and JavaScript. In Flutter, your user interface is completely described within your Dart code. This is also different, in fact, also from Android, for instance, where it's usually a combination of XML files and Java or Kotlin code that describes your user interface and the functionality within your app. In Flutter apps, everything is, both the UI and the business logic is done within the same Dart language. Now, as I said, it's all about describing your user interface in terms of what your app state is, which means that you need some way to do that. And that's where the build method comes in. That's really the center point of your Flutter app, which takes state, your build method for each widget takes your state and converts it into the user interface. And this is why state management is so important in Flutter, as it is, for instance, in React or React Native And you'll hear people talk, if you get into Flutter, you'll hear people talk almost endlessly about state management. But that's because it's such a key part of using the framework. And finally, your Flutter code looks the way it does because it's written in the Dart language. Now, for those of you who may have used any other C-like language, JavaScript, Java, possibly even things like Objective-C, Swift, Kotlin, this should look reasonably familiar because it was meant to. Like the Dart language was built as one of its key requirements is for it to be familiar to developers coming to it from another C-like language. And so if you have a look at this very simple Hello World example, I think if you've got experience with any one of those languages, you might not understand everything, but it should be fairly straightforward to understand what's going on in this bit of code, where it's simply there's a main function, which is where everything starts. And these are actually all nested constructors, which are simply basically being passed into each other. And this is partly where I was talking about the deep hierarchies of widgets come from. The fact that you basically nest widgets inside of other widgets and down the tree. But really, if you look at something like this, you get a flavor roughly for what Flutter code will look like. I don't want to go into any more details than that, but hopefully this kind of whets your appetite to dig deeper and find out more once you start trying out Flutter for yourself. Now, I mentioned widgets, and in Flutter, widgets are basically the key thing. They are the be all and end all. Everything in Flutter, essentially, in terms of the user interface, is a widget. And when I say everything, I really mean everything. So if you are familiar with some other form of UI development, whether it's native mobile or web, you might be used to, for instance, specifying, say, the margin or the padding on a user interface element. In Flutter, padding is its own widget. Like there's essentially everything that you want to do within your UI when you're describing it in Flutter is done by a widget. And the key thing about widgets is that they are stateless by default. What that means is that unlike in other frameworks, your widgets are essentially immutable. Once you create them, you can't really change them. And if necessary, they're actually recreated every frame. So when I say frame, that's the frame being drawn on the screen, so 60 times a second, the widgets are recreated if necessary. Of course, most of the time they don't need to be recreated because they probably haven't changed. So there's lots of optimizations in Flutter to make it perform really well, but if necessary, because they're stateless, they can be recreated whenever there needs to be because they're very lightweight. They don't have state, so it doesn't cost the Flutter engine very much to constantly create them as needed. However, it's not very useful if your app can never change, if it can't like maintain any state. So you actually can, of course, have state. Like I said, there is state management there's lots of different kinds of state management available in Flutter, but the kind of most basic level is what are called stateful widgets. But really, it's a bit of a misnomer because stateful widgets don't really have state themselves. They're still stateless. What they do is they delegate to another class that keeps track of the state for them. And as I mentioned previously, everything pretty much is by composition in Flutter, which means you compose more useful widgets out of more basic, simple widgets. So you're essentially, it's like Lego, if you like. You build bigger and bigger things out of really simple components, and you do so by composing them together. So you might compose some very basic widgets into another widget, then you might take that widget and some other widgets and compose it into another bigger widget, and so forth and so on. And that's where we talk about them there being very deep layout trees in Flutter, because you're basically building your whole user interface out of very simple elements. And everything is, of course, all these elements are essentially, from your point of view, widgets. Now, in terms of what you can build with Flutter, I just wanted to present this little video clip, which is a number of entries from a competition that was run a little while ago, where people were asked to design different clock faces in Flutter. And what I wanted to emphasize by showing this is how powerful the graphics capabilities of Flutter are. Like, these are some really outstanding apps that people wrote, and you can see like they are super custom graphics, very bespoke, and that's what Flutter gives you, is a very powerful way of doing custom graphics if you want it. So this is why I mentioned the fact that from my point of view, a good way to describe Flutter is as a game engine for apps, because essentially what it lets you do is build apps to a very high level of a very high quality of graphical presentation. And one of the ways it does this is because it uses a library called Skier, which is actually at the heart of Chrome and Firefox for 2D rendering. So it brings to Flutter very rich capabilities in terms of graphics. Also, Flutter doesn't really want much from a system because it's drawing everything itself. This is what I mentioned previously. Like when it draws a button on the screen, say on an Android device, it's not using the Android operating system's way of drawing a button. It's doing it itself. Likewise on iOS. So in theory, you could actually draw an iOS style button on Android when your app is running on Android, or vice versa. You might like have a material design look and feel to your app even when it's on iOS. And that's because essentially Flutter is drawing every pixel itself. And it does that because it doesn't really want very much from its underlying operating system. All it really wants from whatever system it's running on is a canvas to draw on, or I should say an OpenGL surface, or like it uses now Metal on iOS, and inputs from the system. And essentially everything else, it does it for itself. It's very self-contained. It's graphically very powerful. So it really lets you have the freedom to do whatever you want in terms of your user interface. You're not restricted or limited by the kind of standard user interface elements that iOS or Android or any other operating system might give you, and that you'd normally be that would be what you would be forced to use if you're doing native development, or that would be your starting point at least for native development. Now, as a developer, what Flutter also gives you that's a huge benefit is very high velocity development. And if you're coming from any experience with mobile development, you will be very pleasantly surprised at how well this works and what a great benefit this is. Because one of the key things it has is what's called stateful hot reload, which means not only is it very quick to push changes that you've made into your app, but they are, for the most part, applied into a running app. So as you can see in this little example that's running on the screen, what it gives you is the ability to make changes, not all changes, but most changes to your code, and actually have them applied while your app is running. Your app is not restarted, so you don't lose the state of your app. So in this case, you can see that you've actually been able to click a button, the app is tracking how many times the button's been pressed. You can then make a change, and that change is applied while not losing that state. The fact that, for instance, the button had been tapped 4 times, the app gets refreshed, I should say reloaded, without losing that in-memory state. And that is a super powerful piece of functionality to have as a developer, because that means you can iterate really quickly and essentially paint your user interface of your app to life on the screen as you go, without having to have all these pauses as you would in other systems while the code gets compiled, pushed to the device, the app gets restarted, you lose all the state. So you might have been like several screens in, you have to recreate that just to go back and tweak, say, a color or a layout of a button or another element on your screen. Now, there's also other really great things about Flutter that give you a very good developer user experience. Like I mentioned before, that it's reactive. You also have what's called the unidirectional flow. You have also a UI inspector, which lets you easily look through your user interface and actually jump from your user interface to the actual line of code that created any particular part of the user interface, which is also a huge productivity win. In some cases, as I said, like hot reload can't work because you're making too big a change, so it can't preserve the state of the app. But in that case, what you have is what's called hot restart, which, while it does restart the app, it does so quickly, just literally in a couple of seconds, that you're still very much more productive than you would be with other native tools. So for instance, myself, I've done many years of Android development, and it was just a complete breath of fresh air to come to Flutter and to see how much more productive I could be with Flutter in terms of editing and making changes to my code and seeing them basically on the screen in a running app in front of me. Now, otherwise, other things that are really useful, of course, like if you're doing cross-platform development, like all these things are just useful, even if you're just doing it for one, even if you're just building an Android or an iOS app, this is fantastic. But of course, a lot of people these days want to cover both platforms, so iOS and Android, or perhaps even other non-mobile platforms, which I'll talk about in a sec. So having a single code base that gives you this is great. And that, as I mentioned, Flutter gives you complete implementations of different design system widget sets. So Google's Material, as well as what they call Cupertino, which is essentially Apple's like iOS human interface guidelines widget sets. Now, finally, in terms of tooling, what you have is also a freedom of choice. Like for instance, on iOS, if you're doing native iOS development, you've essentially got Xcode and that's it. There's not really too many other choices. And even in Android, like most people use Android Studio. For Flutter, you've actually got the choice of either Android Studio or VS Code as fully supported first tier IDEs that Google supports for doing Flutter development. You've also got the Flutter command line tools. So if you want to do that with some other preferred editor IDE, you can still do that. Of course, it supports, like I said, and the mobile OSs, Android and iOS. Also, what it more recently supports is web, which is currently in beta. So you can actually, from the same code, also build a web app using Flutter. And even more recently, there's support for both Mac OS, Linux, and Windows on the desktop, and they are in beta, alpha, and development releases. So while they're still very much, I guess, it works in progress, I have to admit that like I've been using on a personal project the Linux desktop support for the last few weeks, and it's actually already mature enough that you can build a reasonably sophisticated app with the state of the tools as they are now. So really what Flutter gives you now is not just coverage of Android and iOS as mobile OSs, but also web and desktop. So essentially every major platform that you might want to build for, Flutter gives you the ability to create apps all from one single code base. In terms of the Flutter ecosystem and community, which is the community is the bit that I'm, I guess, quite a bit involved in. It's rapidly growing, and it's growing now. It was growing rapidly from a low base. Now it's growing rapidly from quite a large base. So in terms of the package ecosystem, like what for instance, people who might be coming from JavaScript would be very keen about this. There's over 7,000 new packages that have been published on Flutter or Dart's website called pub.dev, which is the package manager. This basically the equivalent of npm for people who come from the node, from a node or web background, the equivalent of Maven, who might be coming from a Java background, or CocoaPods if you're coming from an iOS background. Now, in terms of apps, Google's actually recently said there's now 90,000 plus apps in the Play Store that have been built with Flutter. Of course, we don't know how many there are in the iOS store because Apple doesn't publish that, but given the fact that Flutter is a cross-platform or multi-platform tool, not just cross-platform tool, and the fact that probably many people are using it because of the fact that they can publish their app both in the Play Store and the App Store, I would suspect that there's a very large number of apps now in the iOS App Store that are also built with Flutter. And in terms of open source, Flutter itself, every piece of Flutter is open source, all the way from the very high level widgets all the way down to the engine, and everything in between is completely open source, and is also also developed in an open environment under a BSD license. And there are literally hundreds of people who have contributed to the Flutter code base. And finally, in terms of the status, Flutter is now at version 1.2. Flutter does releases in what they call different channels. which are like similar to what happens in other environments. So they have a stable channel, which most people are using, but they also have beta and development channels for people who want to try out the more kind of not so stable, more recent code changes that are coming along. They also have and they have releases to the stable channel from those kind of more cutting edge channels roughly every quarter. There's also what are called platform views, so it lets you use things like Google Maps or web views within your app. So you still can use these native views that come from Android or iOS within your app as well. You're not, just because Flutter is drawing every pixel, you're not limited by that. So you still can use plugins to bring in these native platform views. You can also create your own plugins. So any kind of bespoke or special function, a custom functionality you need, where you need to use a platform view, or you might need to use a bit of platform functionality, that's completely possible with Flutter's plugin system. Now, in terms of kind of like the software engineering side of things, Flutter has a specific continuous integration, continuous deployment service called CodeMagic available, which is super easy to use. It's by far the easiest one I've used in many years. There's also a tool for vector animations called Rive, which makes it really nice to create very special, or very, I guess, very high quality, sorry, not special, very high quality animations that you can use within your Flutter apps. And it's a web-based tool, so you can basically use it from anywhere where you've got access to a browser. You don't have to have like a Mac or a Windows PC to install it. You can just basically use it from any browser. And there's also a workflow that if you do happen to have like an existing Android or iOS app that lets you add just Flutter as another element of your app. So you don't have to completely start from scratch. You can simply build new features and new functionality within Flutter for your app while still keeping all your existing code. Finally, Dart as a language has been evolving very rapidly. There's been lots of nice new features that have been added to it in the last couple of years that basically put it on par with the other kind of top tier, if you like, languages that are used for mobile and desktop development, which is Kotlin and Swift. And one of the features that it doesn't have, that I have to admit that those two languages do, is something called null safety, which really improves the quality of your code. But that's something that's like literally in progress at the moment, and it's about to arrive in Dart probably by the end of this year. It's already in testing at the moment and development. So that's another kind of really nice new feature that's coming along for Flutter app development within the next few months. And with that, that's about it. I've got like here a list of resources that I could recommend for people who'd like to jump in and learn more about Flutter. The websites for Flutter and Dart are fantastic. There's so much documentation there that it really will get you up and running, and also cover every kind of reference bit of documentation that you might need when you get more in depth into working with Flutter. You don't have to install anything to get started. There's dartpad.dev, which lets you basically, gives you like a web playground in which you can try out little bits of Dart and Flutter code to just see what it's all about without actually, just to sort of like test things out, without actually installing even the Flutter SDK or an editor or anything else. You don't need to, all you need to do is fire up a browser and go to that website. I think Chrome is preferred, but others should work too. There's some free courses on Udacity and App Brewery, which will help you get started really quickly with Flutter if you want to like try those out. There's just an enormous amount of content on YouTube, both from Google and other people, on how to get started with Flutter, learning all the different elements of Flutter, learning about different widgets. Like the widget of the week is a fantastic series of videos, which is like 2 or 3 minutes long. So they're really short, but they just teach you about one particular widget. And you can just basically watch those whenever you have a couple of free minutes and learn something new about Flutter. And of course, I couldn't help not spruik our local meetup here in Melbourne. I suspect that there might be ones local to yourselves in Adelaide. At the very least, like you have this great new club to talk with like-minded people about Google technologies and Flutter. But you can also jump on to our Australia New Zealand GDG Slack, which basically everyone's welcome to join, and there's lots of conversation happening there from people all over the country, not just about Flutter, but also about Android and other things to do with Google. So everyone's more than welcome to come along there and participate. There's also other chat channels, there's other Slacks, there's just a huge amount of resources. So there's no shortage now of places on the net where you can find out all about Flutter and have your questions answered. And speaking of questions, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions if we've got time, but I'm also on the usual like Twitter, and I'm on our GDG Slack under Max, and also on GitHub. So most welcome to ping me in the future if you have any questions down the track. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maxim. So it was a great speech. So if there's any questions, anybody, now is the great time to ask. We have one question: best book or tutorial to learn REST API.
I'm not sure about like learning about REST APIs, unless you mean talking, using Flutter to talk to a REST API, or I see, integrating it with Flutter. Flutter comes with its own basic HTTP library, which will get you going with like basically talking to any REST API. But there's also specific Dart packages that you can use in your Flutter apps that will make it easy, especially if you've got quite large APIs that you want to talk to. Or for instance, if you want to integrate with a GraphQL API, one of the Flutter team members, Brett, who's actually based in Sydney, has actually created a code lab, which I forgot to, I'll pass those details on. There's a whole bunch of what Google calls code labs, which will help you learn specific aspects of Flutter or other Google technologies. And there is a specific code lab that he's done showing how to use GraphQL to actually integrate with, get some data out of GitHub. So there's lots of different ways you could integrate with API, REST APIs or GraphQL APIs with your Flutter apps. In terms of REST rather than GraphQL, I think there's a few quite nice libraries. One that comes to mind, I think, is called Chopper, which makes it quite easy to integrate with quite complex APIs just through using annotations. Like, it means you don't have to write too much code to deal with them. So, and things like, of course, JSON encoding, decoding are all built in. Or if you want fancier things, there's code generation tools that let you deal with quite complex JSON data structures if you need that in your Flutter apps. So yeah, there's heaps of ways of doing that in Flutter. I suppose there's another question. Can we build Flutter code on Azure DevOps? Yes, in fact, before I came to this talk, I was literally on Azure CI looking at why my last build had not built successfully. So 100% yes, you can use Azure DevOps to build your Flutter apps. So like I mentioned CodeMagic just because they're specifically orientated and focused on Flutter, and there's definitely others. Like I've also used GitHub Actions. You can use Azure DevOps. I think other people use Bitrise. So basically most of the major CI vendors now support Flutter. There's another question. So let me just see. Do you have any recommendations on a CMS system to integrate with like Drupal? I do know that there's at least one, what they call a headless CMS, which actually has a native Flutter SDK for it. I can't at the moment remember the name, but I can get back to you with a link to that. But yeah, like it's just a matter of like what kind of APIs involved. I haven't dealt very much with Drupal, and it's been a long time since I've dealt with WordPress. But for instance, if I needed to talk to WordPress with a Flutter app, it would be fairly straightforward, just using the normal APIs that are available. So yeah, that's definitely possible. To serve content coming from apps, yes. So yeah, like I've actually written a couple of apps that do just that pull content from a backend CMS system and display it. It's actually a really good task for Flutter, because Flutter gives you the ability to essentially style your user interface however you like. So it's much closer, for instance, to web development versus native mobile development, and how much freedom you have to do whatever look and feel you want using the content that's coming from your CMS. Another question. Um, the difference between REST API, retrofit API, and Volley API. Oh, I see. So, okay, yeah, this is, I guess, someone coming from an Android background. So, for instance, retrofit and Volley are two quite well-known libraries in the Android world. So, retrofit gives you basically, like, it's almost a standard way now of dealing with REST APIs on Android, because it gives you the ability to essentially just use annotations, writing very little code in order to interact with a REST API. That package, the Dart package I mentioned earlier, Chopper, I think is actually influenced or like inspired by retrofit. So yes, there's definitely equivalent things there. Volley, I haven't used, but I'd imagine, like, if you're familiar with that, it won't take you long to pick up the way similar packages work in Flutter. There's another one. A good online playground to learn Flutter. Yes. So there's actually two great on now. As of a few months ago, or about 6 months ago, there's actually two great online playgrounds for learning or experimenting with Flutter. Dartpad, even though it's called Dartpad, actually now has been extended to support doing Flutter. So that's a great one that's done by Google. But also, for those of you who come from a web background, you might be aware of CodePen, and CodePen have recently added Flutter support as well. So that's another great online playground where you can try out your Flutter. And if you actually search around, you'll find that people have been posting some like amazing UI examples on CodePen using Flutter. So yeah, just do a quick Google search and you'll find lots of info about that as well. So Dartpad and CodePen are both great places to try out Flutter with, just online with nothing but a browser. I think that may be all the questions. Going once, going twice, I think so.
Okay. So I would like to thank Maksim for doing this great session about Flutter. I think everybody have a good idea about how to use Flutter and get the first step to start building apps. So I will share the GDG Adelaide page. So we will be able to, we have recorded the session, we'll be able to share it with you all. And I would like to thank Maksim again, and also the GDG Adelaide team, and also everyone else to joining this session. I hope you all learned something new. So be safe. These are tough times, and enjoy learning. You can get your skills up. This is a good time. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.